The quiet strength of Miss Lillian. Westbridge Academy wasn't just another elite institution, it was a beacon of privilege and refinement. Tucked away behind towering iron gates and tall, ivy-covered stone walls, it was the sort of place where traditions were sacred, and the influence of old money shaped the corridors. The teachers were impeccable, the students were affluent, and the very air around the place felt polished, like the gilded edges of a family heirloom. But what most people didn't see were the hidden stories, the ones that didn't get written about in brochures or talked about at alumni events. These were the stories of the quiet, unsung heroes who kept the wheels of the school turning behind the scenes. One of these unsung heroes was Miss Lillian Thomas. For over 37 years, Miss Lillian had worked as the school's custodian, maintaining the cleanliness of the sprawling campus with a dedication that few could ever hope to match. Her mornings began before the sun rose, with a soft cup of coffee and a prayer for strength, and she would quietly make her way through the campus with her ever-familiar cleaning cart. No matter the weather or her mood, she always arrived on time, her presence a constant and calming force. Lillian was a petite woman, with deep brown skin that had become weathered over the years by time, but it only seemed to add to her grace. Her gray hair was always neatly tied back in a bun, her apron immaculate as she glided across the halls, cleaning, dusting, scrubbing away the remnants of the day. To most students, she was a part of the very fabric of the school, a constant presence who knew the school's creaking floors and the quiet whispers in its hallways better than anyone else. Her smile was warm, her words always kind. But Miss Lillian's story was more than just a job. It was a testament to resilience and grace under pressure. She had been born in a small, poverty-stricken town, one that never seemed to change. She had dreams once, big dreams, dreams of teaching children and inspiring minds. But life had a way of rearranging plans. Family responsibilities, financial hardships, and the subtle yet ever-present barrier of racial discrimination made her dream of becoming a teacher seem like an impossible fantasy. And so, instead of classrooms filled with eager young faces, Lillian's life took another turn. She became a janitor, working in schools, hospitals, and office buildings, always working tirelessly, always doing her best, but always just out of sight. Though she was a woman of quiet humility, Lillian had always been a source of strength to those who needed it most. Her wisdom, gleaned from years of life's trials and triumphs, had helped shape the lives of countless students. When she came to Westbridge Academy, it had been a small, relatively new school, and she was hired as a part-time custodian. But over the years, as the school grew in reputation, so did her presence. Students would often stop to chat with her while she dusted the trophy case or polished the marble floors. It was there, in those quiet moments, that she saw the greatest successes and failures of the students she worked alongside. She watched as shy freshmen became confident seniors, as young boys grew into doctors and lawyers, as girls transformed into fierce, intelligent women. Some, she had seen struggle through tough times, battling personal demons, fighting against the weight of their own insecurities. It was then that Miss Lillian knew she had become more than just a janitor. She was the quiet observer, the silent counselor, the one who offered the steadying hand when students fell. But through it all, there was one thing that had remained constant for Miss Lillian: the school had always been a place of respect for her, even if the students never fully acknowledged it. She had never been treated as less than anyone else, and in her quiet way, she had earned that respect from everyone, teachers, students, and administrators alike. That is, until Chase Donovan came along. Chase Donovan was everything that Miss Lillian had seen too many times in her life, a young man with all the potential in the world, yet with the arrogance of someone who thought they had already achieved everything. Chase, a new transfer student, had come from an exclusive prep school where his father's wealth opened doors that Chase had yet to fully appreciate. Chase's attitude was one of privilege. He carried himself like the school owed him something, like every room he entered should bow to his presence. And yet, he had a reputation for being a bully. He'd gotten into trouble at his previous school for causing disruptions and being disrespectful to those around him, but Westbridge had taken him in anyway, hoping to reform him, to channel his arrogance into something more productive. Chase saw his arrival at Westbridge as little more than a temporary stop before his rise to a future that was already paved. He had no respect for the tradition of the school or for the people who made it work. Teachers were simply obstacles between him and his high status. Other students were simply rivals to be crushed. When he first encountered Miss Lillian, he didn't see her as a person. He saw her as nothing more than an old janitor, an invisible cog in the machine of the school. Her existence was irrelevant to him. But, for some reason, that made her the perfect target for his cruelty. It started small, a snide comment here and there as he walked past her in the hallway, a mockery of her quiet ways. He would see her cleaning and make exaggerated motions, mocking her movements. At first, it was just teasing, harmless in his eyes. But as the days went on, his insults grew louder, more pointed, and more malicious. One morning, as Miss Lillian cleaned the floor of the main hallway, Chase and his friends passed by, laughing amongst themselves. He deliberately stepped into the freshly mopped area, his foot skidding on the slick floor. "You'd think you could mop faster, old lady," he shouted over his shoulder, causing his friends to burst into laughter. Miss Lillian didn't flinch. She simply watched him, her warm brown eyes taking in his every move. "Watch your step, son," she replied softly. "The floor's wet." Chase turned back, his face twisted in mockery. "Yeah? Well, maybe if you didn't move like a snail, I wouldn't have to deal with this," he sneered. His friends laughed even harder. Miss Lillian didn't engage with them any further. She simply returned to her work, her dignity unshaken. But inside, her heart ached, not for herself, but for the young man who could so easily belittle others. The breaking point. A few days later, the taunting escalated. Miss Lillian was cleaning the cafeteria after the lunch rush when she overheard Chase making yet another comment. This time, however, he crossed a line. "Hey, Miss Lillian," he called out, stepping up to her with exaggerated bravado. "If you want to keep this place clean, you better move a little faster. But then again, we wouldn't want you to strain yourself, would we? Wouldn't want you breaking a hip, huh?" The words stung, but Miss Lillian kept her composure. She looked up at him, her expression unchanged. "You don't know anything about me, young man," she said quietly, her voice calm but firm. "You don't know my story, and you don't know what it takes to keep going every day. But if you keep this up, you'll find out soon enough. Life has a way of teaching us lessons we don't expect." Chase scoffed and walked away, his friends snickering behind him. But for the first time, there was a flicker of something else in Miss Lillian's eyes, a warning, perhaps. She had spent her life being silent, enduring slights and insults, always choosing to rise above. But something about this young man's arrogance stirred a fire inside her that had long since smoldered. The reckoning of arrogance. The following weeks at Westbridge Academy felt like a delicate dance between quiet dignity and searing pride. Miss Lillian's presence remained the same, unwavering, calm, and composed, but something inside her had shifted. The taunts from Chase Donovan had left a mark, and though she remained outwardly calm, she knew that it couldn't go on. For the first time in 37 years of service, she felt a deep ache in her chest, not just for herself but for the broken nature of the young man who had chosen to bring cruelty into her life. Chase, on the other hand, felt something else entirely. He wasn't accustomed to resistance. His arrogance had always protected him, it was his armor, his shield from the world. Yet, Miss Lillian's response to his insults left him perplexed. She had said little, but her words had been like a quiet storm brewing under the surface. Still, in Chase's mind, he had won. After all, the old janitor had said nothing more than her usual soft-spoken warnings. She'd let him walk away with nothing more than a dismissive glance, and that, to him, was a sign of weakness. He would get under her skin eventually. Everyone else did. But Miss Lillian wasn't like everyone else. It was a brisk Wednesday morning when the storm finally broke. The fall air had a bite to it, and the early morning mist still clung to the grass. Chase had returned to school after a brief absence, still basking in the misguided glow of his past antics. His arrogance had been fueled further by the fact that his peers had accepted him into their clique of privileged students. He was the one who got attention, he was the one who had the last laugh. It was during third period, as he strutted down the main hallway, that he saw Miss Lillian again. She was in her usual place, cleaning the floors just outside the administrative offices. He smirked, feeling the familiar itch to make her uncomfortable once more. It had become a game, a way for him to assert his dominance over someone he deemed beneath him. And today, he had a plan. He knew exactly what he'd do. "Hey, Miss Lillian," he called, raising his voice so everyone nearby could hear. "Are you sure that mop is the best way to clean? You might want to upgrade to something a little more modern. We're in the 21st century, you know." The students around him snickered, glancing at Miss Lillian with condescending curiosity. They had come to expect the spectacle by now, Chase making a fool of an adult who was too far beneath him to fight back. But this time, something was different. As he made his way toward her, Miss Lillian didn't flinch. She stood with her head held high, her face calm but with a fire smoldering behind her eyes. She didn't immediately respond to his taunt. Instead, she glanced down at the floor she had just finished mopping and then met his gaze. "Young man," she began, her voice low but firm. "You don't know anything about the work I do. You don't know the value of these hands that have cleaned, built, and supported this place for longer than you've been alive. I've watched this school grow. I've seen generations of students, some of whom are now your teachers, grow up to change the world. I don't need modern technology to do my job. My job is not about the tools, it's about the heart behind it." Chase hesitated. This wasn't the response he expected. The students around him were silent now, unsure how to react to Miss Lillian's defiance. "Do you know what it's like," she continued, her voice gaining strength, "to serve without recognition? To give everything to a place that will never fully acknowledge you? To dedicate your entire life to something and still be invisible? Do you know what it's like to be someone people only see when something is broken or needs fixing?" Chase opened his mouth, but no words came out. His bravado had begun to falter. For the first time, he realized how little he actually knew about the people around him, especially the ones he had so carelessly belittled. Miss Lillian took a slow, measured step forward, and her gaze softened as she spoke once more. "I'm not your enemy, Chase. But you will learn something today. You will learn that no amount of power or money can fill the emptiness that comes from hurting others. You may think you have all the answers now, but life has a way of humbling us when we least expect it." The words stung, but they were also a challenge, one that Chase wasn't prepared for. He stood frozen for a moment, unsure of how to respond. The students who had been laughing just moments ago now stood silently, their eyes flicking between Miss Lillian and Chase. And then it happened. "Get a load of this," Chase sneered, trying to salvage his pride. "The janitor's giving me a lecture. What's next? You going to write me up for making your job harder? You don't scare me." But Miss Lillian simply smiled, the warmth returning to her eyes. She shook her head slightly, as if she pitied him. "No, Chase," she said quietly. "I'm not trying to scare you. I'm trying to remind you of something that every person who's ever worked hard has learned. You're nothing without respect. You're nothing without the kindness of others. And one day, you'll realize that the very people you look down on will be the ones who carry you when you can't carry yourself." Chase scoffed, trying to hide the unease that had begun to settle in his chest. "Yeah, sure," he muttered, brushing past her and heading toward the nearest exit. "Whatever you say, old lady." As the day wore on, however, the confrontation lingered in Chase's mind. He tried to shake it off, pretending that it didn't bother him, but the words that Miss Lillian had spoken echoed in his thoughts. He'd never met anyone like her before, someone who was so sure of herself, so unshaken by the power he thought he wielded. By the time the final bell rang, Chase was in a strange place. The taunts he had made toward Miss Lillian now seemed hollow, like cheap insults thrown in an attempt to mask his own insecurity. He couldn't stop thinking about what she had said, "You're nothing without respect." It wasn't just her words, but the way she had said them, the quiet strength, the unshakable confidence. It was almost as if she had revealed a side of him he hadn't even known existed. For the first time in a long while, Chase was left questioning himself, his actions, and the kind of person he was becoming. That night, as he lay in bed, his mind raced. For the first time in his life, he didn't feel superior. He didn't feel like the top of the food chain. Instead, he felt something new, shame. And deep down, he knew that something was changing. The turning point. The days that followed were unsettling for Chase. He had always prided himself on his ability to control every situation. His charm, his quick wit, and his status at Westbridge Academy had all been tools in his arsenal, but now, those very tools felt inadequate. He couldn't shake the memory of Miss Lillian's quiet strength, nor could he ignore the ripple of unease that had settled in his chest after their confrontation. It was a Thursday morning when the storm finally began to stir inside him. He found himself walking down the same hallway where he had mocked Miss Lillian just days before. The familiar scent of freshly cleaned floors lingered in the air. He almost laughed at the irony, the same floors he had once mocked now seemed to symbolize something deeper. Chase had no idea what he was feeling. It was like a fog had settled over him, blurring his thoughts, but Miss Lillian's words had carved through the haze with a precision that left him unsettled. She had been right about one thing: he wasn't as untouchable as he'd thought. He'd spent so many years believing that his status, his confidence, his money were enough to shield him from the consequences of his actions. But Miss Lillian had shown him that his arrogance had a price. Despite all of this, he still didn't know how to apologize. Chase had never been one to admit fault. He wasn't even sure he knew how. The idea of walking up to her and offering a heartfelt apology felt foreign, like something other people did, not him. It was easier to pretend that nothing had happened, to simply act as if everything had returned to normal. But deep down, he knew it couldn't be that simple. It wasn't long before Chase found himself standing in front of Miss Lillian once again. He hadn't planned it, but there she was, cleaning the floor just outside the gymnasium. She worked silently, her movements practiced, her face serene. She didn't even notice him approach. For a moment, he stood frozen, watching her work. Her quiet dignity struck him again. This woman had spent decades caring for this school, this building full of teenagers who barely acknowledged her existence. Yet, she stood unbroken, as steady as the walls themselves. Chase opened his mouth, but no words came out. He stood there, struggling to find the right thing to say, but nothing seemed adequate. Miss Lillian, however, was the first to speak. Without looking up, she addressed him, her voice calm but laced with a quiet strength that made him stand a little straighter. "You're still carrying that weight, aren't you?" she said softly. "The one you don't want to admit you're carrying." Chase's heart skipped a beat. She had seen through him again, just as she had in the hallway days before. He felt exposed, vulnerable in a way he had never felt before. I don't know what to say," he admitted, his voice barely above a whisper. Miss Lillian paused, then finally looked up at him. Her gaze was steady, not accusatory, but full of understanding. "You don't need to say anything," she said gently. "It's not about words. It's about actions." Her words hung in the air, and Chase realized just how deeply they resonated. He had spent so much of his life relying on words, on clever insults, on manipulation, on charming his way through situations. But what Miss Lillian was telling him was that actions spoke louder than words. The hurt he had caused her couldn't be fixed by a simple apology, it needed to be addressed by something deeper, something more meaningful. "I've made mistakes," he said, his voice trembling slightly. I treated you horribly. I don't know why. I don't know why I did it. I was just trying to fit in, I guess. Miss Lillian's expression softened. We all make mistakes, Chase. But the real measure of a person isn't in how they fall. It's in how they rise. Do you understand? He nodded, though he wasn't sure if he did. The weight of her words settled heavily on his chest. Rising was harder than falling. It was the part that most people never quite mastered, especially people like him. It meant taking responsibility, owning up to the things he had done, and making a conscious effort to change. But could he really change? Could he turn back from the path he had chosen? You don't have to apologize to me, Miss Lillian continued. You need to apologize to yourself. To the people you've hurt without even realizing it. Chase felt a sharp pang in his chest. He had spent his whole life thinking he was above others, that he was better than them. Now, he was realizing just how wrong he had been. The arrogance, the superiority, it wasn't strength, it was a mask, a way to cover up his own fear and insecurity. He had been the one who needed to change all along. As the days passed, Chase began to take Miss Lillian's words to heart. He couldn't undo the things he had said, but he could start acting differently. It wasn't going to be easy, but he was willing to try. It was time to stop hiding behind his arrogance and start facing the consequences of his actions. Chase's first step was small but significant. He made a point to greet Miss Lillian every time he saw her. At first, she didn't acknowledge the change. She simply continued with her work, giving him the same warm smile she always had. But over time, he noticed a slight shift in her demeanor. She no longer saw him as the arrogant young man who had belittled her. Instead, she saw the beginning of change. Then, Chase took another step. He began volunteering to help with various school events, helping to set up chairs for assemblies, cleaning up after sporting events, and even assisting with the school's charity drives. It wasn't that he expected praise, he was simply trying to show people, Miss Lillian included, that he was capable of doing more than just using his words to get by. He wanted to prove that he could be someone who contributed, someone who respected the work others did. The students and teachers at Westbridge Academy noticed the change, too. It wasn't dramatic, but it was there. Chase had always been the center of attention, but now he was starting to fade into the background, quietly making an effort to be better. It wasn't perfect. He still had moments of doubt, moments when his old habits tried to resurface, but for the first time, he found himself questioning his actions before they happened. It was a cold Friday afternoon when Chase found himself in the hallway again, walking past Miss Lillian as she was finishing up her work. This time, he didn't hesitate. He walked up to her, his heart beating fast in his chest. Miss Lillian, he said, his voice steady. I just wanted to say thank you. She paused, raising an eyebrow. Thank you? For everything, Chase said, his eyes meeting hers. You've shown me something I didn't know I needed to see. I don't expect you to forgive me, but I wanted to at least acknowledge that I've been wrong. Miss Lillian smiled, her eyes twinkling with a quiet satisfaction. I think you've already started forgiving yourself, Chase. And that's the hardest part. For the first time in his life, Chase Donovan felt a sense of peace settle in his chest. The arrogance that had once defined him was beginning to crumble, piece by piece. He didn't need to be the center of attention anymore. He didn't need to prove anything to anyone. What mattered now was the change inside him, the quiet strength, the humility, and the respect for others that Miss Lillian had shown him were far more valuable than any status or power he had ever held. The new beginning. The next few weeks at Westbridge Academy unfolded with an unexpected calmness. Chase Donovan, the young teacher once notorious for his arrogance, was no longer the center of attention. Instead, he found himself in the background, quietly going about his work. The students still respected him, but there was something different now. They noticed the shift, the subtle change in his demeanor, his willingness to listen, his ability to offer support without judgment. He wasn't perfect, but he was trying, and that was enough. For the first time, Chase found himself truly caring about his students, not just as future professionals, but as human beings. The smug, self-centered thoughts he used to entertain were slowly being replaced by a growing desire to help those around him. It wasn't a dramatic shift, it was a slow, almost imperceptible evolution of his character. He still had moments of self-doubt, moments when the old Chase wanted to resurface, but now, he knew better than to let those thoughts dictate his actions. Miss Lillian's influence had seeped into his soul in ways he never expected. Her quiet strength had unlocked something inside him, a part of him that had been buried under layers of pride and insecurity. She had shown him the power of humility, the strength that comes from lifting others up rather than tearing them down. And most importantly, she had shown him that change wasn't just about saying the right things, it was about living them. It was a Wednesday morning when Chase found himself in the school's courtyard, standing at the edge of the fountain where students often gathered during their breaks. He had been assigned to supervise the lunch period, a duty he had always dreaded in the past. But today, it felt different. Today, he stood there, not as a teacher looking to control the students, but as someone who wanted to make sure they felt safe, seen, and valued. As he scanned the courtyard, he noticed a group of students gathered near the steps, laughing and chatting. A few of them waved at him as he passed by, and for the first time in his career, he didn't feel like he had to put on a facade. He wasn't the cool teacher anymore, the one who made jokes and expected everyone to adore him. No, he was just Chase, no pretenses, no ego. As he continued walking, his eyes fell on Miss Lillian. She was out in the courtyard as well, her cart in tow as she cleaned the benches and swept the leaves that had accumulated from the trees above. She was a constant presence, her gentle movements a reminder of the steady strength that had been at the heart of Westbridge Academy for so many years. Chase paused for a moment, watching her work. She was a woman who had spent her life in the background, serving others with dignity and grace. He had mocked her once, treated her like she was invisible, but now, he saw her in a completely different light. She wasn't just the janitor. She was the heart and soul of the school, the silent backbone that had held everything together for decades. He approached her slowly, unsure of what to say. But before he could speak, Miss Lillian turned to him with a soft smile. "Good morning, Chase," she said, her voice calm and steady as always. "Good morning, Miss Lillian," he replied, feeling the weight of his words as he spoke them. "I wanted to thank you for everything." She raised an eyebrow, as if she wasn't entirely sure what he meant. "I know I've said it before, but I don't think I truly understood it until now," Chase continued. "The way you've carried yourself all these years, it's made me realize how much I've taken for granted. You've taught me more than I ever could have learned from any textbook or class." Miss Lillian's smile deepened, her eyes twinkling with a quiet understanding. "You've always had it in you, Chase," she said. "It was just a matter of finding the right path. Sometimes, we all need a little nudge to see the things we've been overlooking." Chase nodded, feeling the truth of her words settle in his chest. He had always believed that he had to be the loudest, the most charismatic, to make an impact. But now, he understood that the real power came from listening, from observing, from quietly doing the work that others often overlooked. "I don't know if I'll ever be able to fully make up for what I did," Chase said, his voice soft. "But I'm going to try. I'm going to keep learning. Keep growing." Miss Lillian's eyes softened, her gaze filled with compassion. "You don't have to be perfect, Chase," she said. "You just have to keep moving forward, one step at a time." As the days turned into weeks, the change in Chase became more evident. His students began to notice the difference, too. He was more approachable now, more willing to listen. His lessons no longer revolved around impressing his students with his knowledge or his quick wit. Instead, he focused on making them feel valued, on helping them grow not only as students but as individuals. One afternoon, as he was grading papers in his classroom, one of his students, a quiet girl named Emily, approached him hesitantly. She had always been one of the more reserved students in his class, and he had often wondered if she felt overlooked. "Mr. Donovan?" Emily said, her voice shy. "Can I talk to you for a second?" "Of course, Emily," Chase replied, looking up from his work. "I just wanted to say, thank you," she said, her cheeks flushing with embarrassment. "I've been struggling in class, and I thought you'd be annoyed with me for asking questions. But you've been so patient. I can tell you actually care." Chase's heart warmed at her words. It was the first time a student had acknowledged the change in him, and it felt like a small victory. He had spent so many years thinking he had to be perfect, but now, he realized that simply being present for his students was enough. "Thank you for saying that, Emily," he said. "I'm here to help you however I can. Don't ever feel like you can't ask questions. That's what I'm here for." One afternoon, months later, Westbridge Academy held its annual awards ceremony. The gymnasium was packed with students, parents, and staff, all gathered to celebrate the achievements of the school year. Chase had been nominated for Teacher of the Year, an honor he never would have imagined receiving in the past. He felt humbled by the nomination, but it wasn't the award that mattered most to him. It was the journey he had undertaken, the personal transformation that had changed the way he saw the world. As the ceremony progressed, it came time to announce the winner of the Teacher of the Year award. Chase sat in the front row, his hands clasped tightly in his lap. When his name was called, he stood up slowly, surprised by the applause that filled the room. He made his way to the stage, his heart racing in his chest. Standing before the microphone, he looked out at the crowd. His eyes briefly met Miss Lillian's, who was sitting near the back. She gave him a small, knowing smile, and in that moment, he knew she was proud of him. "Thank you," he began, his voice steady. "I don't deserve this, not yet. I've made mistakes. I've treated people terribly in the past. But I've learned something in the time I've spent here, and it's not about awards or recognition. It's about the people you help along the way. It's about making a difference, no matter how small." He paused, looking at the faces of the students and faculty in the audience. "None of this would have been possible without the people who've taught me how to be better. Miss Lillian, especially, has shown me the true meaning of humility, kindness, and service. She's a living example of what it means to make a difference, quietly and without expectation. And I hope, in time, I can live up to the lessons she's taught me." The applause that followed was loud, but it wasn't for the award. It was for the man who had finally found his way, thanks to the quiet, unwavering strength of a woman who had been serving others all along. Ripples of change. The following year at Westbridge Academy marked a turning point not just for Chase Donovan, but for the school itself. Change, as subtle as it had been, was now taking root in every corner of the institution. And while Chase was certainly one of the catalysts for that change, he would be the first to admit that it wasn't just him, it was the people who had shaped him. Miss Lillian, in particular, had become his compass, her influence quietly guiding him through every challenge, every decision, and every interaction he had with his students and colleagues. Chase had made it a point to reach out to those he had once alienated. Teachers who had kept their distance from him now found themselves in the rare position of being invited into his classroom to share advice, guidance, and their own experiences. It was a humbling process, but one that Chase knew he had to go through. For years, he had prided himself on being self-sufficient, on believing that he could handle everything alone. But the truth was, real growth came from collaboration, not isolation. One particular teacher, Mrs. Hamilton, who had once been a colleague he barely spoke to, became one of his closest allies in this new chapter. She had been teaching English for over 20 years, a veteran of the school system with a reputation for being strict but compassionate. Initially, she had seen Chase as nothing more than a young man with too much ego and not enough substance. But over time, she saw the changes in him. She saw the way he listened more than he spoke, how he encouraged rather than commanded, and how he slowly but surely earned the trust of his students. One afternoon, after a particularly challenging class, Chase and Mrs. Hamilton found themselves alone in the teacher's lounge. The students had left for the day, and the quiet hum of the fluorescent lights filled the room. Mrs. Hamilton had a cup of coffee in her hands, her tired eyes taking in the man who had once been a source of her frustration. "You've changed," she said simply, her voice carrying the weight of years of experience. Chase looked at her, unsure of how to respond. He had heard the same sentiment from his students, but hearing it from Mrs. Hamilton, a woman who had witnessed the growth of countless teachers, felt different. "I know," he replied, his voice quieter than usual. "I didn't think it was possible, but here I am." Mrs. Hamilton smiled, a small but genuine smile. "You've learned something important. And not just about teaching, but about life. You've realized that teaching isn't just about knowledge. It's about understanding, compassion, and sometimes, just being there for your students when they need you most." Chase nodded, his thoughts lingering on the truth of her words. "It's more than I ever thought it would be. I used to believe it was all about the content, the lessons, the material. But now I know it's about the connections you make, the people you help along the way. You're not the only one who's been changed, Chase," Mrs. Hamilton continued, her gaze softening. "You've been a part of something bigger than yourself. You've inspired those around you to reflect, to grow, and to become better. And that's a rare thing." Chase felt a warmth spread through him at her words, but also a humility he had never known. He was no longer the teacher who sought approval. He was the teacher who sought to understand, to build something lasting, not just in his own life, but in the lives of the students and colleagues he had come to value. A month later, the school was in the middle of its annual parent-teacher conferences. Chase had prepared meticulously for the event, wanting to show the parents of his students that their children were not just numbers in a gradebook but individuals with potential, struggles, and dreams. This was a new approach for him, one that focused not just on academic achievements, but on personal growth. The first parent he met with was Mrs. Carter, the mother of one of his most promising students, a young man named Elijah. Elijah had always been quiet, often keeping to himself, but there was a sharp intelligence behind his eyes that Chase had recognized early on. Unlike the previous years, where Chase would have focused solely on Elijah's academic performance, this time, he focused on the whole student. "Mr. Donovan," Mrs. Carter said as she shook his hand, her eyes filled with a cautious curiosity, "I've heard a lot of good things about you lately. My sons told me that you've been a different teacher this year." Chase smiled, grateful for her open-mindedness. "I've tried to be," he replied. "I've worked hard to make sure I'm not just teaching the material, but also making sure Elijah feels supported and understood." Mrs. Carter raised an eyebrow. "Supported? Understood? That's not usually the word parents use to describe a teacher. But I appreciate it." Chase leaned forward slightly, making eye contact with her. "You know, Elijah is a bright student, but he's not an open book. I've learned that sometimes the quietest students are the ones who need the most support. And it's not always about getting the best grades. It's about building the confidence to speak up, to take risks, and to know that they're not alone in the process." Mrs. Carter looked at him for a long moment, her expression unreadable. Then, with a deep sigh, she said, "I'm glad to hear that. Elijah's had a rough time. I think he's afraid of failing. But you seem to be the kind of teacher who can reach him in ways others haven't." As the conversation continued, Chase felt a shift within himself. For the first time, he was no longer concerned with how others perceived him or whether he was getting the recognition he thought he deserved. What mattered most was that Elijah's mother trusted him, that she believed he could make a difference in her son's life. That was the kind of impact Chase wanted to have. Later that evening, as Chase walked to his car, he noticed something that stopped him in his tracks. There, standing by the school's front entrance, was Miss Lillian, her cleaning cart by her side as she prepared to head home. The dim streetlights cast long shadows across the courtyard, and for a brief moment, Chase felt the weight of the years they had both spent at Westbridge Academy. He approached her quietly, taking a deep breath before speaking. "Miss Lillian," he said softly, "I wanted to thank you. For everything. You've helped me more than you'll ever know." She turned to face him, her smile as serene as ever. "You've helped yourself, Chase," she said with quiet wisdom. "All I did was show you what was already inside you. You just had to open your eyes." Chase smiled, his heart full of gratitude. "You've taught me more than any class or textbook ever could." "Good," she replied, nodding slowly. "Because that's the real lesson, isn't it? We all have the ability to change. We just need the courage to take that first step." As Chase watched Miss Lillian disappear into the evening, he felt a profound sense of peace. He was no longer the man who had walked into Westbridge Academy all those months ago, the man who had been consumed by pride, arrogance, and self-interest. Now, he was someone who truly understood the value of humility, the importance of listening, and the power of service. It wasn't a perfect transformation, but it was a start that had the potential to impact not just his own life, but the lives of countless students and colleagues for years to come. And for the first time in a long while, Chase felt ready to face whatever the future held.